Okay. So Matt, you had some feedback about documentation and how to share service-like code in LoopBack, if I remember correctly. Would you like to talk more about this?
Yeah, so a number of my colleagues have started picking up LoopBack for some of the projects that we're working on, and I think the number one I don't want to say complaint. The LoopBack documentation is in many ways very thorough, but in many ways it's also not super organized. And there's a couple of places where there's like little things that aren't really shown off. For an example, the service decorator, if applied to a provider, will inject the value versus the service itself. And that's sort of the thing that makes sense, but it's not really documented anywhere. So really, the only thing I have to report from them is they would like to see some sort of better organization for certain high level topics. As it is right now, something like if you want to do authentication or authorization, you start in the documentation and then you have to look in the code and then you have to look in other parts of the documentation because the pieces can be in several places. For example, you have to look into the sequence documentation to see some of those bits and pieces. And yeah, it's just a question about organization. There's a lot of documentation there, so I understand it's not an easy topic to cover.
Yeah, I think we need to have more cohesive stories and maybe find a way so that some of the materials will be visible from many different angles. Like, as Matt pointed out, like say, hey, if we really need to understand how authentication works, somehow at some point you have to know like there's some middleware in the sequence that will do the enforcement. But if you coming from the authentication perspective, how we can make that transitional navigation easy to follow without losing the big picture. So we probably need to have a lot more like a story or path-driven or scenario-driven kind of documentation that chain the different pieces together to paint good pictures for our users to follow along.
Do you might have any suggestions on like what kind of content would help your teammates? Are they looking more for a tutorial to guide them through, I don't know, setting up authentication, or are they looking more for like explanations to explain how different pieces work together, or what kind of content would help?
I think specifically the questions that were raised to me were about the concept of binding values to a context and understanding if you bind something in the context of a request, for example, like in a REST controller, like how do you access that context specifically? And I didn't actually have a good answer for them because I wasn't really sure. I've written a couple of sort of custom services for a Redis queue job listener, for example, and I just sort of created my own custom context, and inside the controllers, that context is available. But for something like a classic REST server, if you're familiar with the concept of express router params, the idea is that given a known route, if you are working on a known entity in a RESTful way, so if you have like company/company ID and you're going to be operating on a company ID, and from working with your code that you always need a certain set of data loaded. Well, what is the best way to just go ahead and inject that, and so that it's always available in those constructors? So how could you inject a parameter or a service based off of the value of another parameter? Or in this case, I think what we ended up settling is just ensuring that all of our services are transient, and then just having local private member variables for storage. But there just wasn't a lot of clarity. Like the documentation for context inheritance is super clear. Like it actually makes a lot of sense. But when you're operating inside of a RESTful controller, what is the current context? How do you get it, and how do you work with it? I think was the question that I was facing.
Yeah, that's probably true. I think the complexity around the hierarchical context concept and the different binding scopes, and also how we instantiate different artifacts in different scopes will impact the visibility of the context. So maybe some tutorial in that area will be really helpful. Try to, define a sample scenario and kind of populate the context hierarchy with some sample values. Then when we talk about the request response cycle, we can say, hey, really, we first of all, we have the application, and we register all kind of different artifacts from the booting process, like the controllers, services, and also some contribution from the components. So that's pretty much flat in the application context. So in the application context, you will see the controllers, services, REST server, that kind of stuff, right? Then any so we have a singleton server instance for a given HTTP endpoint. So any request coming, that server instance will pick up the thing and construct a request context, which represent the request response object coming from Express. But the request context is a child context of the server context, which also is a child context of the application context. Then all the middleware should be able to see the request context, and depends on the scope of the middleware. Like if it's a transient, which is a default, then you will see the request context as a primary context for the injection. That can go all the way into the controller service repository. And if you understand how singleton works for your performance optimization, then you might be able to, mark some of the controller or like service singleton. But in that case, there's two different contexts associated with the entity. One is the one who instantiates the instance. The other one is the incoming request context, how you gain access to that. So I started to write some documentation to tell, like, if you want to access the HTTP raw request response, how you can do that. And we can probably generalize the similar idea to explain, real world like scenario, what the different layer of a context will play different roles in a concrete path. So I think that would be really helpful. Yeah, we have pieces of information here and there. For example, when we talk about the binding scopes, we cover a few use cases to justify why we need to have these different kind of scopes, and also we have a table kind of illustrate like for any given binding, what is the resolution context, what is the owning context, what is the current context. So it's kind of being described in the abstract form without correlating to a concrete scenario too much. So people probably get lost in kind of these details. So kind of like have a scenario to walk through what Matt probably just described would be really helpful, I think.
And how should we approach this tactically? Should we create GitHub issues to like plan the work or keep track of it, or should we just keep it up in the air?
I think we can have an issue to track this documentation requirement. Then we can come up a tutorial like for review.
Sounds good. Matt, would you mind creating the issue yourself and describe?
Will do. I am taking
cases.
And I will make sure. Unfortunately, I'm booked in meetings for most of the day. I should be able to do so by about 2 p.m. PST.
No rush. That's fine.
and I can, take the first step to come up, the skeleton of the tutorial, which hopefully will cover the most common scenarios people need to have a good understanding how all these different concepts work together.
Sounds good. Is there anything else to discuss regarding the documentation, Matt or Rifa?
Oh, personally, I can only really comment on a blanket level, because that I think we just need more time to vet through the documentation, because right now there's just a lot of things to go through. So there's a lot of bits and pieces that may be slightly out of date, such as the memory connector PR that I'm trying to push right now, and also some areas that may not be as clear. One thing I think we might want to consider when writing the documentation is that we should try not to tell the users too many things at once. So, for example, I believe, like for example, we have a let's see if I can remember where it is. We do have like some documentation that explains, oh, it does A, but then, oh, like for example, express middleware, you can usually the quickest way to add express middleware to an existing scaffolded application is to just use, your app dot express middleware and then the express middleware. But then the first thing that appears to the users is the documentation on how the sequence works. So I think that may not be helpful for users who are not too familiar with LoopBack 4, because it adds another level of prerequisite of understanding how sequences work, and it may lure users into modifying the sequence directly instead of using the more simple .express middleware function within the application constructor. So I think we could potentially be mindful on how we organize or how we write the documentation, so that uh, it doesn't try to assume that the users know so much information. And then we should try to cater to the simplest use cases first, and then maybe give the users opportunity to look into other more advanced documentation lower down in the page itself, so that new users or users who are not too familiar with LoopBack can still quickly use the features that they want, or more advanced users will not be left out with hidden features.
Makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of the guidelines we have for READMEs, where usually READMEs start with basic use, which is describing the use for new users, which would be app.express middleware, and then the rest of the README can go into further details for more advanced users. So maybe that's a practical way how to put your proposal into our docs.
Yeah, I think that's also consistent with Microsoft's promotion of the four quadrant idea, like for the usage scenarios, like you want to instruct people to do app express middleware. That's pretty much like how to guide, right? So you just teach them how to do things without going too much deeper in the explanation. Then for advanced users, like the simple usage probably won't help them. Then they probably have to dive into the more detailed explanation. Say, hey, actually behind the scenes, the express middleware basically construct a middleware and inject the middleware into the sequence. So if the express middleware itself won't do the job for you, you can dive down into the more lower level middleware stuff. Or if your middleware is not just a plain function and you want to have injection of the configuration, then you should wrap your express middleware into a factory so that you can get the injection of the configuration to separate the two concerns. So basically starting with simpler use cases and have separate sections to explain the plumbing behind the scenes, and meanwhile, like incrementally introduce more advanced use cases.
Yep. So I totally agree. That's pretty much the gist of it. While on the topic of documentation, the other thing that I at least I think we may be helpful is that at least to give some perspective, right, to preface this. Typically, when you think of typically, at least from what I see, right, the market of Node.js developers, they are not too familiar with the Java-esque concepts that Loopback 4 tends to implement, like dependency injection, inversion of control, and all these binding scopes and how binding works in general. So I think, I mean, currently there is quite a comprehensive documentation how on the context binding and dependency injection. But I think since uh, uh, Loopback 4 is on a technical level is indeed a meta framework, I think it could potentially benefit from a beginner's guide to these kind of concepts. So like a tutorial series just on this kind of things.
So, Rafa, in that context, would you feel it would be more sensible, like we kind of isolate the documentation for the core foundation into its own kind of areas, like say, hey, for potentially platform users that want to utilize our dependency injection framework as their foundation, here's how the IOC and the dependency injection works together, and what are the advanced features we have. So kind of have a counterpart as some other standalone IOC frameworks like Diversify. Then we, as part of the loopback 4 documentation, we claim the whole user experience is built on top of this powerful, IOC container. So we leverage, good amount of patterns and ideas from that to make the whole system composable and extensible. But we just describe what's necessary for enable certain features in that context. So this way, you kind of left the foundation to more advanced developers. And by our observation, we know from the number of downloads, we know some people actually use the IoT container without the rest of the framework. And the gap, it's not just very minimal. It's kind of I think at least like tens of thousands of differences, right? So that means there's some target audience really want to leverage our capability of the foundation to build their own ways of the framework or applications. But tangling these two things for average users could be overwhelming. So if we can find a way to separate the two things and build a bridge between the two, could be would that be helpful in your mind?
I think that can be helpful as long as we can take into consideration in being able to explain to users who want to use Loopback 4 as a REST API to understand how these concepts work and why it is like that. Because I think that's a common question, right? Like, why is Loopback 4 so different from Loopback 3? Why is it so-called more, in quotes, more complex? Because I mean, we know the reason why Loopback 4 is designed that way. It provides more extensibility because it's a meta framework, so it can add a lot of more features beyond just being a REST API. However, these are not really clear cut for new users who are looking at Loopback 4 for the first time. And because these concepts tend to not be as widely used among Node.js developers, as far as I know. So because like if it's Java, then you can probably assume that. But then in the Node.js marketplace, I think we need to at least provide us at least some kind of tutorial on explaining, on guiding through step by step what are these, what is the dependency injection, what can you do with it, and why it is actually useful.
That's right. Yeah.
Go ahead, Raymond.
Yeah, I like the path-driven kind of storytelling ideas, and we are trying a couple of things, and I think that's kind of well received for the improvement. For example, we come up a tutorial or article kind of talk about what's inside the LoopBack application, right? So basically explain what's a typical usage scenario that LoopBack applications is good, really a good fit. And we didn't dive into a lot of technical details, but kind of unfold the common use cases and the common integration requirements, and then try to map these requirements to some of the high-level loopback concepts. For example, if you want to access a database, right, then we tell you, hey, in the loopback abstraction, we need to configure a data source so that we understand how to connect the database. Then behind that, we have abstraction of the connector, which is something built on top of the driver that abstract away the crawl operations against that particular database. But to really give you the strongly type access to your database for a given model, then we have the so-called repository idea. Okay? So this way, you start to go from the higher altitude with your application understanding and decompose the application requirement into a few different perspectives, then kind of lead the perspective onto different platform enablement features in LoopBack. So I think that article has been viewed so many times. And recently, Yapa just published his own LoopBack 4 tutorial, really coming from core maintainer and early adopters angle, try to walk through the different features of LoopBack 4 beyond just getting started. I think these kind of articles will be probably really helpful. It really connect the dots from the application requirements into the technology stack.
I would like to circle back to what Rifa said in the beginning, and he was talking about dependency injection, and how Node.js developers are not familiar with it. And as I understand it, if you think about how typical Node.js applications look like, if you need a dependency, you call require and get it from another file. If you need to set up like an instance of a service, as Matt mentioned earlier, you put it on Express request object, right? You have, well, everything is stored on request in Express. It's kind of the IOC container in Express. So people familiar with this style, when they come to LoopBack, I can imagine they are confused about how should I access my dependencies? Why cannot I just require them? Why do I need to use inject instead? And how it all works together. So I think it would make a lot of sense to explain the concepts of dependency injection, inversion of control in the context of LoopBack. So we can use LoopBack to show examples, to explain what are the benefits, where they can benefit from this design, and even show some best practices, like how they can structure their application code to get most of dependency injection. So I think that's what we are missing.
Yeah, that's a good idea to really understand the usage patterns for people before LoopBack, and also illustrate why LoopBack want to promote a different way, and what's the benefits of doing that. So I think this will enable people coming from different backgrounds to get on board. As Rifa said, people coming from enterprise Java or C# side, maybe they don't feel there's much a gap of barrier to understand the concept of IOC and the benefits of dependency injection. But for just playing Node.js developers coming from the Eclipse background, which kind of use a kitchen sink approach to access all the contextual information, and just using a plain require statement to compose all the things together, that may feel lost because of the new ways of doing things, which for the simple use cases, the plain ways works well, and it's easy to understand, but they probably won't see the benefit of adopting IOC or dependency injection right away. So we need to pave that path for this kind of audience so that they can get on board more smoothly, I guess.
Yep. Is this in line with what you are thinking, Rifa?
Yeah, this is pretty much in line with what I have in mind. I think it may be quite helpful for Node.js developers who may get a bit. I mean, sometimes when you're a Node.js developer, you may be familiar. Oh, it's always been done this way. Express.js has always done it this way. From A framework B has always done it this way, and and then when you come to loopback and then you see, oh, that entire table has turned 180, and then you have all these new foreign concepts, it can be a little frustrating when you're trying to learn and trying to understand the framework, but then you don't really know what the exact benefits are. So you're kind of trying to learn, and then hopefully you will eventually find out that. So I think it's great to be able to explain how, what, why we're doing it this way, and maybe as a bonus, it's not necessarily in line with our best practices, but we could also remind Node.js developers, hey, a loopback for application is still a Node.js application. If you really wanted to, you can still import or require the library that you want, and you can still call it directly in the controller. I think because loopback 4 tends to have this level of magic in it. I mean, by design, it will have this level of magic in it. People tend to maybe be, I'm not too sure, but I think they may be a bit afraid to like import directly and use it directly in the controller, because like, oh, I should be using a service, I should be doing this. But then for people who have a tight schedule and they need to quickly learn the framework, and they don't want to necessarily bother too much about best practices, I think we should be able to provide an avenue for them to, or at least tell them, hey, you can still do it the typical Node.js kitchen sink method if you really wanted to. You can, and then you can refactor later. You can redesign it later at a later time once you have time. So I think we might want to put some emphasis that this is possible. You can still use it like a normal Node.js application.
Yeah, that's exactly true, because personally, I've been asked so many times, like, hey, I have a backend or have a database. Do I have to come up with a connector, or do you guys have a connector for that? And I always tell them, hey, this is just a plain Node.js application. The typical wisdom will work here. You can require a library. You can write your customer logic behind the controller to do whatever they have to do. You don't necessarily have to come up a abstraction of the connector. You don't have to wait for somebody to develop a connector for you. For example, if you want to talk to an email service, right? You don't necessarily need to have an email component. You just kind of require the library you need, and you can create abstraction as a service for your email access. But the bottom line is, controller is still a regular Node.js application. You can require the library and call the library directly. Yeah. So I think that's a good point. Like, even though we promote more flexible design patterns for large scale applications, but for ad hoc requirements, we shouldn't forget this simple and then way to solve these problems. So I think we probably kind of sometimes missing that angle. We kind of assume everybody understands that, but once we start to promote like more advanced patterns, then people feel that's the only way to go.
Rifa, could you please create issues for these topics or for these tasks? I have captured two items. One is you mentioned that Express middleware, documentation for Express middleware is starting with explaining all the complicated things, and it's a bit lost how to actually use it. So I think that would be a good one. And another one is how to better describe dependency injection for newcomers. And if there are any other changes you would like to see, then feel free to open more issues.
Sure thing. I'll open them soon.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I think in general, the framework really has a lot of capabilities and a lot of hidden features. Even though we try our best to document individual features as part of the documentation effort, but we probably somehow need to step back and find ways to glue all these features together in the context of application scenarios. And speaking from my own experience, like I recently, becoming part of the team to develop some IBM internal microservices that utilize LoopBack, and it's a fairly complex microservice that can benefit from the LoopBack plumbing, like say, multi-tenancy support, integration with many different kinds of backends, implementing security and the metric stuff. So that really helped me to connect some of the application scenarios back to the loopback features. And if our documentation can always catch these kind of perspectives, that will be really helpful. So I have written some skeleton to describe some of the application scenarios and connect them back to the features or patterns we already implemented in Loopback. People don't necessarily know at this point. So I think more stepping back and try to tell as many interesting stories as possible in Loopback 4 and make them available as part of the documentation system. That will be really helpful for the adoption and the ease of usage for many developers.
Thanks, Raymond. And I see that Madaki joined. There's lots of noise coming from your side. Madaki, can you hear us? On mute.
Am I audible? Hello?
Hello.
Yes, am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the noise and sorry for being late. Actually, I just I also read Matt's suggestions regarding, and also I have been working with LoopBack 3 and now on LoopBack 4. And what my suggestion is, we can have a different somewhat like introduction for the multi-service architecture, because most of the people who are coming to LB4 from LB3, they are not knowing and the people are not comfortable. The second thing that I look from the people coming from LB3 to LB4 is that those peoples are actually looking for pre-setups, like if they want to do authentication, just they like in LB4 it's automated role and all those setups. So those peoples are really looking for those kind of pre-built features in those things. And in our documentation, what we are looking, we are not specifying things at the somewheres, but in the last few months we have improved much about it. So the troubleshooting section, yes, you have as you have mentioned, the troubleshooting section we have to add in it. So that things are pending, and I think hope this month we can go for it for the troubleshooting sections and others.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you shared a lot with us in a very short time. So what I'm taking away that you mentioned LoopBack 3 to LoopBack 4 migration, and that there is some content we are missing. Is that right?
Sorry?
You mentioned that we are missing some documentation to simplify migration from LoopBack 3 to LoopBack 4.
No, it's not from migration. Actually, the thing is that when the most of the people has used Loopback 3, so it was a ready-made kind of a stuff. Means when you deploy Loopback 3, you will be having the role mappings and all things in the Loopback 3 scaffold only. So this thing is missing. This thing really peoples are missing, that they are not getting a ready-made role things and ready-made authentication system built in. Even though we are trying to build those up, so that is the thing that people are really missing, because in the previous, when people install the loopback 3, they all they get all those things like authentications and all those role mappings automatically. It is over there. So the people really who are migrating from lb3 to lb4 are missing that, and most of the newcomers which are coming to lb4 are not really knowing about the multi-service architecture. So they are missing those things, how to set up those architecture, how to set up the bindings and other things.
Okay, and when you talk about multi-service architecture, do you mean like how dependency injection works in loopback and how?
Yeah, exactly. The people are missing that. If you have gone through the loopback users questions and all those, most of the people are asking that how to use it, how to make a service, how to do, how to make JWT authentication or other authentication, because they are not aware of those architecture. The most of the people I talked over there on the channel, so they ping me privately, they ask me. So I always tell to them, or go through the structure, read the structure out, and then try to deploy. So the people are not aware of being those things, especially from the Indian region. If I say, I have talked to most of them, and those are not aware of the things. So we have to slightly expand the multi-service documentation area over the how it is actually working in LB4.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like sometimes we just assume people have that kind of background and understanding some of the best practices to make the application more flexible and scalable, but not necessarily people coming to LoopBack are fully equipped with prerequisite knowledge. So somehow, like we explain some of the concepts and the use cases in concrete, so that they can learn that path and prepare themselves for the separation of concerns and follow our approach to decompose the application into smaller pieces and also utilize the dependency injection to grow them together. So that's kind of a good reflection of what Rifa said at the beginning as well. Like they're already used to one way of doing things, which works well for simple use cases. Then when they come to LoopBack, there's a gap, like because LoopBack core is really designed to enable more complex applications with more things involved. But first of all, we need to tell them they can still do simple things, make simple tasks easy to work, and then kind of unfold the more complex side a little bit to equip them with that kind of understanding and show them how to incrementally, do things in a more advanced fashion and see the benefits of doing that.
And I think it's also in line with what Matt said in the beginning, that we should explain better to people how they can create bindings, how they can access services or bind them to context, to request context. I think it's similar.
Yeah.
So we can go
through
these two pillars. Okay. And regarding the built-in roles mapping, user roles mapping, I'm not sure. Do we have any? I know there was a spike or proof of concept leveraging RBAC, role-based access control library for LoopBack 4. Do you remember?
I think Jenny actually developed a LoopBack 4 application that kind of mimicked the one we have in LoopBack 3. which kind of giving a path, like say, hey, we have a built-in ACL support in LoopBack 3, which kind of constrain the access by different roles, and how that could be achieved with the LoopBack 4 authorization with the external authorization provider like a Caspin. So she actually wrote the tutorial, wrote the working code to sort of illustrate a how to implement a role-based, access control in LoopBack 4. But I understand, for folks coming from LoopBack 3, sometimes they want to have like out-of-box support, right? But in LoopBack 4, I don't think we have a built-in reference implementation for authorization providers, because we intentionally get rid of the user table-based authentication and authorization provider, which is fairly complicated and not bulletproof for production. We tend to more like guide people to use more mature like authentication authorization systems they already have in place and describe how to integrate with them. But the flip side is because we don't have ready to use authentication and authorization system, that kind of increase the complexity for beginners.
So to maybe extend on that, while we do not have the same built-in vast UAA feature set as LB3 has out of the box, we do have the Authentication JWT extension, which I think provides quite a bit of out-of-the-box features to help people, get started with a very basic rudimentary authentication system. As for implementing something that's full feature end-to-end, I'm personally concerned about that, because for example, in ASP.NET Core, they do have the ASP.NET Core identity framework. However, which allows you to like plug and play a lot of OAuth, OpenID Connect, you can do JWT authentication on your final route, you can do a lot of different things, but that adds a lot of complexity. And with seeing how LoopBack 4 does not have that, that same level of community push as ASP.NET Core, I do not think it would be necessarily a healthy decision to try to invest in something so flexible and yet so opinionated, but yet so complex. Because in the end, it's going to be really difficult to educate people on how these things work. And because identity in itself is already a very complex topic in itself. So I think the current approach is still fine. It's just that because we do not have a necessarily full end-to-end out-of-the-box solution, developers who may not have been familiar with identity management now need to be familiar with identity management. So if you're going from LoopBack 3 to LoopBack 4, you may have this sudden surge of knowledge you need to know now, because you need to implement this yourself. But I think
recently is that if you're going to implement like the full JWT spec for devices with refresh tokens and like device ID tracking, the out-of-the-box JWT auth component is not going to be sufficient. You are going to have to make your own. Having done this, I will actually argue that it's easier to do in LoopBack than it is to just do it in plain old Express with Passport. Having had to do this twice for 2 different systems in the last 6 months. And it might be actually documenting this process so people can actually see it.
So is this with the LoopBack 4 authentication JWT, or is this like completely custom within
actually, while developing, sorry to interrupt, but while developing with JWT authentication new feature, I talked to Jenny about the client authentications, because the Matt is talking about the client authentication or device authentication. Who is going to access our actual LoopBack API? though that information should be stored, and that client should be first authenticated. Okay, he's authenticated, and we can give him the document access. It's not for anyone else. Suppose your login is also somewhat type of bind behind the authentication process. So non users which you don't allow them, they cannot access that particular thing too. So that client authentication, I have talked with Jenny, but I did not get the time to put a POC. So later today or tomorrow I will put out that, so you can comment out about those things.
Yeah, I think like thinking through the end-to-end scenario will be really helpful. Like say we come up with an authentication system and we really need to understand our potential clients and how they can do exchange the credential with us and the different flows they want to do authentication. Like speaking for myself, I have implemented like OAuth 2 protocol a couple of times in different languages, and I can understand why it's so complicated for average developers to even understand the whole concepts and flow, right? So we saw like out of box capabilities. It's sort of hard for them to fill in the gap. So one thing I'm thinking about is like nowadays a few popular providers we know, for example, for a SaaS authentication provider like Auth0, right? So if we can have a extension as a reference implementation to illustrate how LoopBack for authentication authorization works with these backend systems, would that be helpful? Like say, if Matt does not use Auth0 and he uses a different authentication provider, but maybe many concepts, many steps are similar, then with that reference implementation extension, he can quickly just come up with his own solution for his own system. So I'm wondering from your point of view, if that's some directions, this community should try to provide some guidance and even release some extensions, like to really like attack the problems. And I think that approach also give us some good understanding how to divide responsibility, right? For example, if you start with raw JWT, then you take a lot of different burdens. Like say, hey, you have to enable the login path. You need to maintain the credentials for yourself with a table. But if we go, they have a integration example with Auth0, all these non-critical concerns are already being covered by the primary responsible parties. Then it just drill down to the absolutely necessary steps. You get a access token from Auth0. Then you making an API call using the access token into your LoopBack backend. So we need to have a strategy that takes that token, talk to Auth0 API, and retrieve the user information behind that. So Auth0 can reject that token because it's expired, or but if it's still valid, it gives you the enough information, say who's the user behind that, what's the scope permissions for that token, then we can feed that information to the authorization system. So at least like showing some end-to-end with a popular approach. Of course, like we cannot cover all the different security systems on the market, but have one for authentication and another one for authorization. Maybe that's going to be helpful, especially our extensions for authentication and authorization is being designed to, inject some critical services. And these kind of reference implementations will show how the complete picture can work together. Yeah, just throwing some ideas for discussion. And you guys are the practitioners to use LoopBack to solve your own problems. I think you probably will be in a much better position to give us some ideas like how we can know the bar. Of course, like authentication and authorizations are always advanced topics for a lot of developers.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is UAA and overall is just a very difficult topic to cater towards in general. It's never easy, regardless which framework, which system I use. It's always a bit of a mess. So it's not really necessarily a unique case to look back for, but I do think, at least from my perspective, what we've done with Authentication JWT, the perspective we're working with, I think is the right direction because it provides a minimal setup that anyone should be able to easily understand, but then yet extend it with their own stuff. I mean, there's still some missing features like maybe email verification we can add as another thing, perhaps we can add another column to the user and maybe a password reset function that we have not exposed if I'm not wrong. So yeah, I think I don't really have much to add on that front really.
So maybe I can share some opinions regarding the authentication and authorization since I've been working on like refactoring these documentations and also the creating those examples. And yeah, I think so mainly I agree with Raymond. Like they are very complicated topics, and we need to like provide some easy tutorial for community users to get started with them, and we still need to like improve our docs to see how to like improve the user experience when developers want to add more features and customize the behaviors. So I think what we are trying to do is we want to have some very basic examples for users to get started with, and then community also contributes their own extensions and examples, which are usually more complicated. And we try to add those projects in our references so that other community people will learn like how to add more features based on the very basic scenario. And another thing we can improve is so currently I think we have two examples maintained by LoopBack team showing the authentication and authorization mechanism. One is the JWT example, and the other one is the passport login example, which shows how to interact with those third-party middleware like the passport and the Facebook and Google login. And the third one is the access control migration example, which implements the authorization. So maybe we can start with those three examples and see like if so when people ask us questions about how to build their own auth system. So first we can see if we can show them those three examples to satisfy their requirements. I think sometimes people just don't know, like when they have a very complicated user scenario in their mind and how how they can implement those how they can implement the system and what's the how to get started. And so the solution I could think of is people usually ask in the Slack channel or open issues on GitHub, and we can show them those 3 examples and see if they can find their answers inside those 3 examples. And if they have more requirements beyond those basic scenarios, then maybe we can try to find some solutions from those existing community examples and see if that will give them answer. And if they still have some pain point when reading the documentation and they don't know how to realize or implement some of their features, we can see how to improve our documents to include more guides based on their use cases.
So personally, I'm really hoping our documentation site has some commenting capabilities so that people can give a feedback directly related to the pieces that's confusing or missing information. So if we have that, I think we can iterate much more quickly than what we have to do today.
Yeah, I think so. My personal feeling is some people's pain point is so they start with some scenarios that they want to build, like they have their own imagine of the authentication system they want to build, but they don't have a quick way to figure out how to start building them, and they feel like it's a lot of effort of reading and following all of our documentations, but the learning curve is there. I mean, building the authentication and authorization system, the learning curve is there. So I don't know how we can improve to maybe.
Yeah, I think it also took us multiple iterations to decompose the problem and really externalize some of the things that will behave differently for different companies, and create some abstractions around these critical pieces, such as like the token service, the user service, and some other things. But we are trying to entertain the capability to integrate with different backends, which on one hand increase the complexity as well. So we probably just have to keep pushing and try to utilize that for some real world applications, which will expose the gap and help us to improve the implementation and the documentation to make it relatively easier for people to follow. But I agree with Jenny. The part is always a learning curve for a lot of developers anyway. So we need to have a good balance there and see what's the simplest form we can present without dragging too deep into the muddy water.
Right. And yeah, and one more thing to add. So recently I refactored the authorization documentations. So I know that previously we only have a long page with all the concepts mixed together on that page. And recently I break it down into different sections. And I also add the access control migration example. I added a separate page to explain how to understand the authorization system using the access control example. So hopefully that could give community a easier path to understand the authorization, just like what we have. How we have the JWT extension in the authentication system to give people a easier path to understand the mechanism.
So is there any change or any improvement you would like to make in the next few weeks in this area?
I don't have anything in mind, but I would appreciate any feedback from community. Like if you think, just as what Ruben mentioned, like if you think there's anything we can improve and there's anything you feel very hard to follow when you read the documentation, and if you feel we miss any features, just open a Git issue or say it in the Slack channel so we know how to what we can do to improve the documentation.
That's a good advice.
Yep. Thanks.
And we are 10 minutes past the time we should have finished.
Sorry.
So no, it's okay. It's not about you. It's just that the discussion took longer, which is fine. I would just like to call the meeting over now. Thank you all who joined. See you in 4 weeks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All the feedback.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.
All the best. Bye.